For a story-driven piece, the cleanest way to understand Paradox Junction is to treat it as a turning point in the physics of the zombies universe. Not just another outbreak location, but a place where the structure of reality itself is failing. That distinction matters because the current era of zombies, starting with Call of Duty, Black Ops Cold War, and continuing through Call of Duty, Black Ops 7, is built around the consequences of the multiverse collapse that happened at the end of Call of Duty, Black Ops 4. At that moment in the story, the characters destroyed the entire multiverse in order to stop the endless cycle of timelines repeating. All those universes, every branch of reality where different versions of events happened, collapsed into a single surviving timeline. But the destruction was not perfectly clean. Instead of disappearing completely, the remnants of those destroyed realities were pushed into a dimension called the Dark Ether. The Dark Ether is not just another world filled with monsters. It functions more like a compression zone for broken timelines. Imagine the entire multiverse shattering like glass, and all the shards being swept into one place. For years in the story, that place has been sealed off from normal reality. The problem is that humanity keeps reopening the door. Every portal, every experiment, every piece of technology derived from ether energy weakens the barrier between worlds. And as those barriers weaken, fragments of those destroyed timelines begin leaking back into reality. That is the environment the current story is operating in. Which brings us back to Paradox Junction. The name is actually very literal. A paradox is a contradiction in time or causality, two states of reality that cannot logically exist together. A junction is where multiple paths intersect. Put those together and you get a location where multiple contradictory timelines are colliding. The map appears to be built around several versions of the same place existing simultaneously. That already tells us something important about the state of the universe. If multiple versions of the same location can exist side by side, it means the boundaries between timelines are no longer stable. Reality itself is starting to behave like overlapping layers instead of a single consistent history. In earlier zombie stories, timeline manipulation usually happened through specific devices or artifacts. Teleporters, the Moon Pyramid device, or Element 115 experiments created localized disruptions in space-time. But what Paradox Junction suggests is much larger in scale. Instead of one experiment causing a tear in reality, the entire structure of the timeline is beginning to fracture. That is why the map feels less like a battlefield and more like a prison. The crew is not just fighting zombies there. They are trapped in a place where time itself has been tangled. Characters may be encountering different versions of events, locations, or even themselves depending on how the paradox behaves. The presence of a figure known as the Warden reinforces that idea. A warden is someone who maintains a prison. If Paradox Junction is a paradox containment zone, then the Warden may be controlling or stabilizing those temporal fractures. From a story perspective, this makes Paradox Junction something very specific, a holding chamber for unstable pieces of reality. And that idea leads directly to what could happen next. Throughout the history of zombies, Treyarch tends to structure their stories around escalating phases. First, the characters discover the anomaly, then they become trapped within it. Then they find a way to break it. Finally, the consequences of breaking it reshape the entire world. Right now, the story seems to be sitting in the middle of that progression. Paradox Junction is the imprisonment stage. The characters are inside the anomaly rather than controlling it, which means the next major map will probably revolve around breaking that containment. But breaking a paradox prison has consequences. If Paradox Junction is holding multiple timelines together in one place, destroying it could release those timelines back into reality. And that possibility connects to something the story has already been hinting at in the wider endgame environment on Avalon. Avalon appears to contain subtle echoes of locations and events from across the zombies' timeline. Structures, layouts, and environmental details resemble pieces of older maps. These are not direct remakes, but they feel like distorted memories of earlier eras. That pattern suggests something unusual about how the Dark Ether interacts with reality. When the multiverse collapsed, the destroyed timelines did not simply vanish. Their remnants persisted inside the Dark Ether as fragments of historical information. When breaches occur between dimensions, those fragments can reappear in physical form. Think of each timeline as a sheet of glass. When the multiverse shattered, those sheets broke into thousands of pieces. The Dark Ether became the place where all those fragments collected. Now imagine cracks forming between that dimension and ours. Pieces begin slipping back through. A street from one era appears somewhere it should not exist. A weapon designed in a different timeline shows up in the present. Creatures that evolved in worlds that no longer exist find their way into ours. Reality slowly becomes a patchwork made from fragments of destroyed universes. This is where the idea of a museum of collapsing universes comes from. Not a literal museum with display cases, but a world where relics from lost timelines begin appearing everywhere. Entire environments could manifest like artifacts from history. A corridor resembling Kino der Toten might exist next to architecture reminiscent of Origins, while warped landscapes echo elements of Revelations. Each piece would be a fragment of a universe that technically no longer exists. If the barriers between timelines continue weakening, future maps could literally be constructed from those fragments. Entire battlefields assembled from pieces of different eras of zombies' history. From a storytelling perspective, that structure accomplishes two things at once. First, it explains why elements from older games can return without rebooting the storyline. They are not being remade, they are resurfacing as dimensional debris from the destroyed multiverse. Second, it raises the stakes of the Dark Ether narrative. If the dimension contains the remnants of every timeline that ever existed, then it is effectively a cosmic archive of the entire Zombies universe. And archives sometimes preserve more than just places. If timelines leave behind information when they collapse, then echoes of the people who lived in those timelines might still exist there as well. Not fully alive, but not completely erased either. Something closer to residual patterns of memory embedded in the fabric of the Dark Ether. That possibility turns the Dark Ether into something far stranger than a simple monster dimension. It becomes a graveyard of universes where pieces of history are still drifting through the void. Which means the events after Paradox Junction may not just determine the fate of the current outbreak. They might decide whether the shattered remains of the entire zombies multiverse stay buried or return all at once.